In March 2005, a 14-year-old girl walked into the Palm Beach Police Department with her parents. She was shaking and scared, but she was determined to tell the truth. The girl described being recruited by a classmate to visit a mansion and give a massage to a wealthy man for money. What started as an innocent job offer turned into something horrible that she would never forget. The police detective who took her statement knew immediately that this was serious. The girl described a massive mansion, security cameras everywhere, and a man who seemed untouchable. She gave them a name, Jeffery Epstein. The detective had never heard of him before, but he was about to discover that this case would become the biggest investigation of his career. Little did anyone know that this brave teenager's decision to speak up would expose a criminal network that reached the highest levels of power in America. Her courage would start a battle between local police who wanted justice and federal prosecutors who seemed determined to protect a monster. Palm Beach Police Chief Michael Reiter was furious when he heard the details of the case. He was a no-nonsense cop who had spent decades in law enforcement. When his detectives briefed him on the allegations against Epstein, he made a promise: they would investigate this case properly, no matter how rich or connected the suspect was. Chief Reiter had no idea what he was getting into. He assigned his best detectives to the case and told them to follow every lead. Within weeks they had identified more victims, then dozens. Each girl told a similar story about being recruited, brought to the mansion, and abused. The detectives were building an airtight case. They had witnessed testimony, physical evidence, and documentation of a systematic pattern of abuse. Chief Reiter believed they had enough evidence to put Epstein in prison for life. He contacted the FBI and federal prosecutors, expecting them to be grateful for such solid police work. Instead, he encountered resistance that made no sense. The system was about to fail these girls in ways Chief Reiter never imagined possible. By late 2005, the Palm Beach police had collected overwhelming evidence against Jeffrey Epstein. They had interviewed over 30 victims, all telling consistent stories. They had phone records showing Epstein calling the girls dozens of times. They had testimony from his household staff who witnessed the abuse. They had collected DNA evidence from the massage room in his mansion. They even had receipts showing payments to young girls. Detectives documented everything meticulously. They created timelines showing patterns of abuse going back years. They identified the recruitment network that brought new victims to Epstein's mansion. They had photographs of the massage table and the room where much of the abuse occurred. The case file grew thicker every day. Any normal prosecutor would have been thrilled to have such strong evidence. This wasn't a he said, she said situation. This was systematic sexual abuse of minors with documentation that proved it beyond any reasonable doubt. The detectives were confident. They believed justice was finally coming for the rich predator who thought he was above the law, but they were about to learn a harsh lesson about how power really works in America. As soon as Jeffrey Epstein learned he was under investigation, he didn't panic. He did what wealthy criminals always do: he hired the best lawyers money could buy. But Epstein didn't just hire good lawyers. He assembled a legal team so powerful it seemed designed to intimidate the entire justice system. These weren't just attorneys, they were legal weapons. His team included Alan Dershowitz, a famous Harvard law professor who had defended O.J. Simpson. There was Ken Starr, the former judge who had investigated President Bill Clinton during the Monica Lewinsky scandal. There was Jay Lefkowitz, a high-powered attorney with connections to the White House. And there was Roy Black, one of the most feared criminal defense lawyers in Florida. Together, they represented hundreds of years of legal experience and unlimited resources. Their strategy wasn't just to defend Epstein in court. Their strategy was to make sure he never went to court at all. They would use every trick, every connection, and every threat to make the case disappear. And shockingly, it would work. Epstein's lawyers didn't just defend him. They went on the attack. They hired private investigators to dig into the backgrounds of the victims, trying to find anything that could be used against them. They looked for past mistakes, family problems, anything that could make the girls seem less credible. They sent threatening letters to anyone who cooperated with police. They even investigated the police officers themselves. One detective later described feeling like he was being followed. Another received legal threats over minor procedural issues in the investigation. The lawyers contacted the girls' families directly, suggesting that coming forward would ruin their daughters' lives. They painted the victims as troubled teens who were lying for attention or money. It was a classic defense strategy: attack the victims and make them seem untrustworthy. The pressure was intense. Some families backed away, too scared or overwhelmed to continue. But many victims stayed strong, refusing to let Epstein's money silence them. Still, the intimidation campaign sent a clear message: fighting Jeffrey Epstein would be expensive, exhausting, and possibly dangerous. The legal system was being used as a weapon against the very people it was supposed to protect. In 2006, the Palm Beach police wanted to arrest Epstein on multiple felony charges for sexual abuse of minors. They had prepared a strong case and were ready to move forward, but then something strange happened. The case was taken away from local prosecutors and handed to federal authorities. Chief Reiter thought this was good news. Federal prosecutors had more resources and could bring more serious charges. He was wrong. The case went to Alexander Acosta, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida. Acosta was a respected prosecutor who would later become Secretary of Labor under President Trump. On paper, this should have meant Epstein was in even more trouble. Federal crimes carry longer sentences than state crimes, but instead of building on the police investigation, Acosta and his team seemed to slow everything down. Meetings were held in secret. The victims and local police were kept in the dark about what was happening. Months passed with no action. Chief Reiter kept calling federal prosecutors asking when they would indict Epstein. He kept getting vague answers. Something was very wrong. The takeover that was supposed to strengthen the case was actually killing it. What the victims and local police didn't know was that Alexander Acosta was having secret meetings with Epstein's lawyers. This was highly unusual. Normally, prosecutors and defense attorneys might negotiate about minor details, but this was different. Acosta was meeting with Epstein's team at their offices, away from the courthouse, away from any oversight. They were negotiating in private about what kind of deal Epstein could get. These meetings violated standard procedure. Federal law requires prosecutors to keep victims informed about any plea negotiations, but the girls who had been abused were never told these meetings were happening. Acosta later defended his actions by saying Epstein's lawyers were threatening to make the trial a circus that would re-traumatize the victims. But critics believe something else was happening. Conspiracy theorists point to these secret meetings as evidence that Epstein had leverage over someone. Why else would a federal prosecutor meet secretly with defense lawyers to negotiate away a case this strong? What were they really discussing in those private meetings? And who was really calling the shots? Years later, when asked about this time period, Acosta would make a statement that shocked everyone and seemed to confirm the darkest theories. In 2017, when Alexander Acosta was being considered for Secretary of Labor, he had to answer questions about the Epstein case.
Were presented to a grand jury that actually recommended a charge that would have carried no jail time at all. And at the end
Do you regret making this deal in secret?
And at the end of the day,
Do you regret making this deal in
Congresswoman,
secret?
if I could finish, if at the end of the day, Mr. Epstein went to jail, Epstein was incarcerated, he registered as a sex offender, the world was put on notice that he was a sex offender, and the victims received restitution.
13 months in county jail, 12 hours a day, work release. You consider that justice for the devastation of these girls?
And you are aware that Mr. Epstein served that 13 months. He was allowed out during the day, and he had to sleep at a county jail, but he was basically allowed to move and go around the community and do whatever he wants. And then that became a subject of significant criticism.
And I am on record condemning that, and I think that was awful.
And you would say that was a state, that was a problem with the way the state administered the state sentence.
Yes, and I think it was wrong.
Epstein would invite powerful men to his properties. There he would provide them with young women and girls. Unknown to the visitors, cameras were recording everything that happened. These recordings would then be used to blackmail the powerful men into doing what the intelligence agencies wanted. Need a politician to vote a certain way? Show him the tape. Need a CEO to make a business decision that helps your country? Remind him what you have on him. Need a scientist to share research? Let him know you're watching. This kind of operation is called a honey trap, and intelligence agencies have used them throughout history. Epstein's wealth, properties, and connections would all be part of the cover for this operation. The money might not even be real, just an illusion created to make the operation seem legitimate. If this theory is true, it explains everything. Why Epstein never went to trial, why his finances were so mysterious, why powerful people stayed loyal to him, and why prosecutors were told to back off. He wasn't just a criminal, he was an asset. On June 30, 2008, Alexander Acosta's office signed a deal with Jeffrey Epstein's lawyers that would become one of the most controversial legal documents in American history. It was called a non-prosecution agreement, and its terms were shocking. Epstein would plead guilty to just 2 state charges, 1 count of soliciting prostitution and 1 count of soliciting prostitution from a minor. That's it, not rape, not sexual abuse of dozens of children. Just 2 relatively minor prostitution charges. In exchange for this guilty plea, Epstein would serve 18 months in county jail, not federal prison. He would get work release, allowing him to leave jail during the day. And most outrageously, the agreement granted immunity to all of Epstein's named and unnamed co-conspirators. This meant that anyone who helped him abuse girls, including Ghislaine Maxwell, could never be prosecuted federally for these crimes. The agreement was made in secret, violating the Crime Victims' Rights Act, which requires prosecutors to inform victims of plea deals. When the victims finally learned about it, they were devastated. Police Chief Reiter was furious. Even FBI agents who had worked on the case were shocked. This wasn't justice, this was surrender. The non-prosecution agreement didn't just give Epstein a light sentence, it was actually illegal. Federal law, specifically the Crime Victims' Rights Act, requires prosecutors to keep crime victims informed about the status of their case and any plea negotiations. Alexander Acosta and his team completely ignored this law. They negotiated the deal in secret and didn't tell the victims until after it was signed. Years later, two lawyers named Bradley Edwards and Paul Cassell sued the federal government on behalf of Epstein's victims, arguing that their rights had been violated. In 2019, a federal judge agreed. Judge Kenneth Mara ruled that Acosta and his prosecutors had indeed broken the law by keeping the victims in the dark. But by then it was too late. The deal had been made more than a decade earlier, and Epstein had already served his joke of a sentence. The judge's ruling confirmed what everyone already knew: the system had failed these girls. Prosecutors had cared more about making a deal with Epstein than about following the law or protecting victims. It was a rare moment when a judge officially acknowledged that the justice system had been corrupted. But acknowledgement without consequences is just another form of injustice. Despite the illegal secret deal, Epstein's victims refused to give up. Led by lawyers like Bradley Edwards and Paul Cassell, they filed lawsuit after lawsuit trying to hold Epstein accountable and overturn the non-prosecution agreement. These weren't wealthy or connected people. They were mostly young women from working-class families who had been abused as teenagers, but they were brave. One victim, Courtney Wild, became the lead plaintiff in the case against the federal government. She had been just 14 when Epstein abused her. Now, as an adult, she stood up in court and demanded justice. Other victims came forward publicly, using their real names despite the shame and trauma. They gave interviews to journalists. They testified before judges. They refused to let the world forget what had happened to them. Their fight took years and cost them emotionally and financially. Epstein's lawyers fought them every step of the way, using procedural delays and legal technicalities. But the victims kept pushing. They knew they might never get full justice, but they could at least expose the truth. Their persistence would eventually help bring Epstein down, though it would take another decade and a new generation of prosecutors willing to do what Acosta refused to do. In July 2008, Jeffrey Epstein reported to the Palm Beach County Jail to begin his 18-month sentence. But calling it a sentence is almost laughable. Epstein wasn't sent to a regular jail cell. He was housed in a private wing of the jail, separated from other inmates. His cell was more comfortable than most people's apartments. He had a television, books, and special privileges. But the real scandal was the work release program. 6 days a week, Epstein was allowed to leave the jail at 8:00 a.m. and not return until 8:00 p.m. He was supposedly going to his office to work, but there was minimal supervision of what he actually did during those 12 hours of freedom. A private driver would pick him up in a luxury car and take him to his West Palm Beach office. There, behind closed doors, Epstein conducted business, made phone calls, and according to some reports, even had female visitors. One sheriff's deputy who monitored Epstein's work release later said that young women were seen entering and leaving his office. If true, this means Epstein was potentially continuing to abuse women even while supposedly serving time for abusing minors. Jail was just where he slept. His life continued almost unchanged. Everything about Epstein's time in jail was unusual. Regular inmates in the Palm Beach County Jail sleep in crowded cells, eat terrible food, and have almost no privacy or privileges. Epstein had his own space, better food, and treatment that shocked even the jail staff. He was allowed to hire private security guards to watch over him during his daytime work release. This was supposedly for his protection, but it really meant he had personal bodyguards paid for by himself. Sheriff's deputies later testified that they were given special instructions about Epstein. He was to be treated differently than other inmates. Some deputies were uncomfortable with this preferential treatment but felt they had no choice. Orders were coming from above. One deputy, speaking anonymously years later, said the whole situation felt corrupt. Here was a convicted sex offender getting luxury treatment while his victims got nothing. How did this happen? Conspiracy theorists point to Epstein's connections to local politicians and law enforcement. He had donated to campaigns and charities. He knew people who knew people. Even in jail, his money and power protected him. The system wasn't just broken, it was working exactly as designed to protect the wealthy and powerful while ordinary people suffer the consequences of their crimes. Epstein's sentence was supposed to be 18 months, but he didn't even serve that. In July 2009, after only 13 months, he was released early for good behavior. This meant that for abusing dozens of underage girls over many years, Epstein spent barely over a year in minimal confinement. And remember, he was allowed out of jail for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. So he actually spent far less time locked up than even the 13 months suggests. When victims heard about his early release, they were devastated. 13 months for destroying so many young lives, 13 months for a systematic pattern of abuse that spanned years. It felt like a slap in the face. Some victims had spent longer than 13 months in therapy trying to recover from what he did to them. Meanwhile, Epstein walked out of jail with a smile, climbed into a luxury car, and went right back to his mansions and private jets. He was required to register as a sex offender, which meant some restrictions on where he could live and work. But for a man with private islands and properties around the world, these restrictions were meaningless. He simply moved his operations to places where local authorities didn't care or didn't know. The justice system had failed completely, and Epstein knew it. After his release in 2009, Jeffrey Epstein should have been a pariah. He was now a registered sex offender with a conviction for soliciting prostitution from a minor. Normal people would lose their jobs, their friends, and their social standing. But Epstein wasn't normal people. He was rich and connected, and many of his powerful friends stood by him. He continued flying on private jets between his properties. He continued hosting dinners and parties, though perhaps more quietly than before. Some people did distance themselves from him. Some scientists and academics who had taken his donations quietly stopped accepting his calls. Some businessmen removed him from their contact lists, but shockingly, many others continued their relationships as if nothing had happened. Epstein attended social events in Manhattan. He was seen at exclusive restaurants. He traveled internationally. His lawyers had done their job well. By pleading to solicitation of prostitution rather than child abuse, they made it sound less serious than it was. Some people convinced themselves he had been wrongly accused or that the case was exaggerated. Others simply didn't care as long as Epstein was useful to them. The wealthy and powerful often protect their own, and Epstein remained part of that exclusive club despite his conviction. One of the most important pieces of evidence about Epstein's network is the flight logs from his private jets. Epstein owned a Boeing 727 that people nicknamed the Lolita Express, after the novel about a man who abuses a young girl. Flight logs documented who flew on this plane and where they went. These logs have become crucial evidence in understanding who was part of Epstein's world. The logs show that former President Bill Clinton flew on Epstein's jet at least 26 times between 2001 and 2003, including trips to Africa, Asia, and Europe. Britain's Prince Andrew appears multiple times. Famous lawyers, scientists, celebrities, and businessmen are all documented. However, being on the flight logs doesn't necessarily mean someone did anything wrong. Epstein cultivated relationships with famous people, and many flew on his plane for legitimate reasons without knowing about his crimes. But conspiracy theorists see the flight logs as evidence of who might have visited the island or been compromised by Epstein's operation. Some people listed in the logs have denied ever meeting Epstein. Others admit they knew him, but claim they never witnessed anything inappropriate. The flight logs raise questions that may never be fully answered. Who knew what Epstein was doing, and how many powerful people were potentially recorded or compromised? After his release from jail, Jeffrey Epstein returned to his private island, Little St. James in the U.S. Virgin Islands. If anything, activity on the island seemed to increase. Construction workers were hired to build new structures and renovate existing buildings. Boats and helicopters came and went regularly. Young women were seen on the island, though it was impossible for outsiders to know who they were or why they were there. Local residents on nearby islands grew increasingly suspicious. Boat captains who passed by reported seeing young girls sunbathing topless. Construction workers who had jobs on the island told stories about strange requests and even stranger sights. Some claimed to see surveillance cameras everywhere. Others reported underground structures or strange temple-like buildings with gold domes. Epstein's island became legendary in local gossip, but no law enforcement seemed interested in investigating. The island was private property, and Epstein's lawyers made sure everyone knew that trespassing would result in prosecution. Whatever was happening on Little St. James remained secret, protected by water, money, and legal threats. But survivors would later describe the island as a nightmare they couldn't escape, a beautiful paradise that hid unimaginable abuse. One of the most discussed features of Epstein's island is a strange building that doesn't look like it belongs in the Caribbean. It's a blue and white striped structure with a golden dome built on the highest point of the island. Locals call it the Temple, though its actual purpose has never been confirmed. The building is small, maybe 15 feet by 15 feet, with large doors but no visible windows at ground level. Conspiracy theorists have endless theories about this structure. Some believe it's the entrance to an underground facility where the worst abuse occurred. Others think it contained recording equipment for the alleged blackmail operation. Some wilder theories claim it was used for occult rituals, pointing to supposed symbols on the dome and unusual architectural features. Drone footage taken after Epstein's death shows that the dome and other decorative elements were damaged or removed, possibly during Hurricane Irma in 2017, revealing what looks like a flat concrete roof underneath. But this only created more questions. Why was there concrete under decorative elements? What was really inside? Former workers claim it was just a gym or music room, but given all of Epstein's lies, it's hard to know what to believe. The temple remains one of the island's most mysterious features, a symbol of all the secrets that may never be revealed. Despite his 2008 conviction, allegations of abuse against Jeffrey Epstein didn't stop. Throughout the 2010s, more women came forward claiming that Epstein had abused them after his release from jail. If true, this would mean he continued his crimes even after being convicted, knowing he could probably get away with it again. Some women claimed they were recruited to work as assistants or models, only to be sexually assaulted. These new allegations were harder to prosecute because of the non-prosecution agreement, which granted Epstein immunity for crimes committed before 2008. His lawyers argued that any new charges would violate this agreement. It was a legal nightmare that showed just how protective the 2008 deal had been. Law enforcement in Florida seemed unwilling or unable to pursue new charges. The U.S. Virgin Islands, where Epstein's island was located, showed little interest in investigating. Epstein had again found gaps in the system and places where he could operate without oversight. The man who should have been in prison for life was instead living in luxury and possibly continuing to harm people. It seemed like nothing could stop him. His wealth, his connections, and his mysterious protection from prosecution made him genuinely untouchable. But eventually, his past would catch up with him in a way he never expected. In 2017, a journalist named Julie K. Brown at the Miami Herald began investigating the Epstein case. She had heard about the sweetheart deal and decided to find out what really happened. Brown spent more than a year tracking down victims, reviewing court documents, and interviewing everyone involved. Her investigation would change everything. In November 2018, Brown published a 3-part series called Perversion of Justice. The articles exposed the illegal plea deal, interviewed victims, and documented how Epstein had escaped justice. The series was devastating in its detail and made it impossible to ignore what had happened. The articles went viral, being shared millions of times on social media. Suddenly, people across America were angry about a case they'd never heard of before. Politicians started asking questions. Former prosecutors had to defend their actions. Alexander Acosta faced intense criticism. Brown's reporting won numerous awards and is credited with forcing federal prosecutors to finally take another look at Epstein. Her work showed the power of journalism to expose corruption and demand accountability. One reporter, working for months, did what the entire federal government had refused to do. She told the truth about Jeffrey Epstein and forced the world to pay attention. After Julie Brown's investigation was published, pressure mounted on federal prosecutors to take action against Epstein. Victims who had stayed silent for years came forward with new allegations. Lawyers filed new lawsuits. Members of Congress demanded investigations into why Acosta had given such a lenient deal. The media spotlight was finally shining on Epstein in a way it never had before. In February 2019, a federal judge ruled that prosecutors had violated the Crime Victims' Rights Act by making the secret deal. This ruling gave new legal ammunition to those seeking justice. The Southern District of New York, one of the most aggressive federal prosecutors' offices in the country, began looking at the case with fresh eyes. They weren't bound by Acosta's deal because they operated in a different jurisdiction. They started gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses. For the first time in over a decade, Jeffrey Epstein had reason to worry. His old tricks weren't working anymore. Public awareness was too high. Too many people were watching. The protection he had enjoyed for so long seemed to be failing. In June 2019, federal prosecutors would make a move that shocked Epstein and his lawyers. They were finally going to try to put him in prison for good. On July 6, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein's private jet landed at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, returning from Paris. As he stepped off the plane, federal agents were waiting. They arrested him on charges of sex trafficking of minors. Finally, more than a decade after the sweetheart deal, Epstein was facing serious federal charges that could put him in prison for the rest of his life. The indictment charged Epstein with sex trafficking and conspiracy to commit sex trafficking. Prosecutors alleged that between 2002 and 2005, Epstein sexually exploited and abused dozens of minor girls at his Manhattan mansion and his Palm Beach estate. They described the same pyramid recruitment scheme that local police had documented years earlier. Victims who had waited more than a decade for justice felt a sense of hope. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time the system would work. Epstein's lawyers immediately argued that the new charges violated the 2008 non-prosecution agreement, but federal prosecutors argued that the agreement was made by a different office and shouldn't apply. Besides, they said the agreement was illegal anyway. For the first time in his life, Jeffrey Epstein was facing real consequences, and he didn't handle it well. After his arrest, Epstein appeared in court for a bail hearing. His lawyers offered to post $100 million in bail and agree to house arrest in his Manhattan mansion with electronic monitoring. They painted him as a respectable businessman who wasn't a flight risk, but prosecutors presented a different picture. They described finding a safe in Epstein's mansion containing cash, diamonds, and a fake passport. The passport was from another country and had Epstein's photo but a different name and listed his residence as Saudi Arabia. Prosecutors argued that Epstein was extremely wealthy, had connections around the world, owned his own island, and had every reason to flee rather than face trial. They noted that evidence suggested he might have been continuing to abuse women even after his 2008 conviction. The judge agreed with prosecutors. Bail was denied. Jeffrey Epstein would remain in custody at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan until his trial. For a man who had spent only 13 months in comfortable confinement for his previous conviction, real jail must have been a shock. He was housed in a special unit for high-profile inmates who needed protection from the general population. His lawyers immediately began working on appeals trying to get him released, but this time the system seemed to be holding. Epstein was finally behind bars where he belonged, or so everyone thought. While Jeffrey Epstein sat in jail awaiting trial, his properties remained largely untouched. Little St. James Island sat quiet but full of secrets. The strange temple building still stood on the hilltop. The underground areas, if they existed, remained sealed. The mansions in Manhattan, Palm Beach, New Mexico, and Paris held whatever evidence Epstein had hidden over decades of criminal activity. Hard drives, photographs, videos, documents. Who knew what might be found? Conspiracy theorists believed that the most important evidence was on the island. They imagined recording rooms filled with compromising videos of powerful people. They pictured documents that could bring down governments and destroy reputations. Some believed Epstein's arrest was actually intended to secure this evidence before it could be used against powerful people. Others thought intelligence agencies had already cleaned the island of anything truly dangerous. The truth is that we still don't know what was on that island or what might still be there. In August 2019, just weeks after his arrest, Jeffrey Epstein would be found dead in his jail cell under circumstances so suspicious that they would spawn countless conspiracy theories. The man who knew all the secrets would take most of them to his grave. Part 2 of Epstein's story ends with him finally behind bars facing justice. But the story itself was far from over. In fact, the strangest and most controversial chapter was about to begin. Check out Part 3 where we dived deeper into the atrocities of Jeffrey Epstein,